They laughed at her, called her poor, worthless. But what they didn't know? She owned the damn bank. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jasmine stepped into the bank, a cold chill crawling up her spine. The marble floors gleamed with an air of ostentation, polished to perfection, reflecting the grandeur of everything she didn't have. She felt the stares before she even reached the counter, the judgment in the eyes of the staff, the whispered comments she could almost hear behind their tight smiles. Not one of us. It was the kind of place where people didn't have to speak to say everything. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and walked forward. It had to be done today. Her fingers tightened around the crumpled bank statement in her hand, the number on it glaring up at her in stark contrast to the polished world around her. The bank manager's office was just ahead, behind a glossy glass door. This was her chance. She stepped up to the counter, where a woman in a crisp navy suit gave her a quick, dismissive glance, before turning her attention back to the man at her side. He was well-dressed, expensive suit, the kind of person who belonged here. He chuckled a low, self-assured sound. "Oh, I didn't think they let anyone like you in here," he said, glancing at Jasmine. The woman at the counter gave a polite but pointed smile, her lips curling just enough to make it clear she wasn't entirely interested. "How can we help you today, ma'am?" Jasmine held back the knot in her throat. She had been here countless times before, but this was the first time her heart wasn't just racing in anxiety. It was burning with the sting of humiliation. She fought to keep her voice steady. "I need to speak with the bank manager about my account." The woman raised an eyebrow, her tone flat. "I'm sorry, but we typically don't entertain those kinds of requests without an appointment. Can I help you with something else?" "I just need to speak to someone." Her voice was softer now, too soft, a quiet plea that only she could hear. The man at the counter snorted, turning to the woman behind him. "Yeah, they really let anyone in here these days." Jasmine's chest tightened, and for a moment she was on the edge of losing her composure. She glanced down at her worn jacket, the scuff marks on her shoes. Maybe they were right. Who was she to ask for help in a place like this? Before she could stop herself, she heard the words slip out, desperate. "I just need to access my savings." The woman barely looked up. "Unfortunately, you're going to have to make an appointment." She waved a dismissive hand, as if she were brushing away a fly, and that's when it hit Jasmine. She wasn't just being ignored, she was being erased. The man chuckled again, loud and full of arrogance. "Guess the poor really do get desperate, huh?" Jasmine felt the heat of anger rising in her chest. Why was she here again? She had come to this place for help, but it wasn't help she was getting. It was mockery. It was then that a single thought ignited in her mind like a spark to dry tinder. Enough was enough. There was no reason for her to feel small. There was no reason for her to be treated like this. Not in a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary for everyone, regardless of their status. But as the manager's office door remained firmly shut and the staff continued their business as though she didn't even exist, Jasmine realized something. They didn't see her. Not really. She was just a woman in a cheap coat with a torn bag, someone they'd only notice when it was convenient to them. But what if that wasn't all she was? Her hands shook as she gripped the crumpled bank statement. It was a symbol of everything she wasn't, everything they thought she was. And yet here she was, standing in a place that told her she didn't belong. She could almost hear the cruel whispers of the man behind her and the indifferent tone of the woman behind the counter. It was time for that to change. This wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the savings account that had been left to her by her late father, now dwindling away with every unwise financial decision she'd made trying to stay afloat. It was about something deeper, something far more profound. It was about taking back the dignity that had been stripped away from her piece by piece over the years. And then, without thinking, Jasmine stood up straighter. She walked away from the counter, ignoring the whispers she could feel stabbing at her back. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button, the weight of her decision hanging in the air like a storm cloud. No more being overlooked. The elevator doors opened, and as she stepped inside, she finally let herself feel the rush of adrenaline that had been building inside her. This wasn't over. She would find a way to get what she needed, no matter how many people tried to get in her way. Jasmine had never had an easy life, but it wasn't for lack of trying. She grew up in a modest neighborhood, a place where survival meant working twice as hard to get half as much. Her parents had taught her to value hard work, but they hadn't been able to provide her with the luxury of status, comfort, or connections. They had taught her what it meant to survive, not thrive. She'd watched them struggle, fought by their side to make ends meet, and now as an adult she found herself living that same story, just with different characters. But Jasmine wasn't a quitter. No one would ever call her weak. The small apartment she lived in was a far cry from the opulence of the bank, but it was hers. It was modest, but it was her space, where she could reflect, dream, and plan her next step. The nights were often long, filled with restless thoughts about how she could keep moving forward, despite the odds. She worked two jobs, one as a receptionist at a small law firm, the other as a barista at a cafe. Long hours, low pay, but each paycheck was a testament to her resilience. And yet, despite all the work, the hours, the sweat, and the determination, it was never enough. She was always just a step away from slipping into a place she couldn't climb out of. And now here she was, trying to change that. But was she just another dreamer? Another person who thought they could make it in a world that only rewarded the powerful? As Jasmine made her way to the manager's office again, something inside her shifted. She had felt humiliated. The sting of their words, the weight of their judgment, it had all pressed down on her. But in that moment, it all felt insignificant. She knew one thing for sure: she was more than they could ever imagine. She pushed open the office door without waiting for permission, without hesitation. The bank manager looked up, surprised, and a quiet tension filled the air. "I need to speak to the owner." Her voice was firm, her resolve unshakable. Jasmine stood in the sleek, cold bank manager's office, feeling the weight of the stares from the staff. The manager, a well-dressed man in his 50s, barely looked up from his desk. The receptionist, who had dismissed her earlier, looked at her with an air of superiority, and the security guard gave her an uninterested glance. They all saw her as insignificant, like a problem to be ignored. But Jasmine was used to this, being dismissed because of how she looked, where she came from. They didn't see her for who she really was. They couldn't. As the manager stared at her, waiting for her to speak, Jasmine felt that familiar knot of doubt in her stomach. Was it worth fighting? Was she just another woman wasting her time in a place that didn't care about her? She had always been underestimated. Her entire life had been about proving she was worthy of being seen. But right now, standing here, the self-doubt crept back in. But deep down, she knew something had to change. She couldn't keep being pushed aside, not anymore. Jasmine's frustration with being ignored began to bubble to the surface. She took a deep breath, feeling her confidence slowly rise. She didn't need their approval. They thought she was small, but she wasn't. This was her moment. With a steady voice, she spoke. "I'm not leaving until I speak to the owner." The words surprised even her. She could see the manager hesitate, unsure of how to respond. The power dynamic had shifted, and Jasmine felt a surge of control. Jasmine stood there, her heart pounding. The bank manager and staff still didn't take her seriously, thinking she was just another woman in need of help, someone they could ignore. But she knew something they didn't. She wasn't just a nobody in a cold office. She was far more powerful than they could imagine. The manager's tone shifted, growing dismissive again. "Ma'am, I told you we can't—" But Jasmine cut him off, her voice calm and steady. "I'm not here to beg for your help," she said, her eyes locking with his. "I'm here because I own this place." For a moment, the room fell silent. The manager blinked, clearly trying to process her words. Jasmine watched as the receptionist's smile faltered, and the security guard stopped pretending to be busy on his phone. They were confused, uncertain of what she meant. Jasmine pulled out her phone and made a quick call. "Yes, it's me. Can you put him through?" Her voice was businesslike, authoritative. There was no hesitation now. The manager's eyes widened as the phone rang once more. And then, unexpectedly, he heard the voice of the man on the other end. "Hello? This is husband's name. How can I help you?" Jasmine's lips curled into a small smile as the manager's confusion deepened. She could see the realization dawning in his eyes. I need you to speak with the bank owner, immediately. Jasmine's words were calm, but her presence commanded the space. The manager's hands trembled as he handed her the phone. Jasmine didn't flinch, even as the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. As the phone call continued, Jasmine could feel the change in the air. The staff who had dismissed her, the manager who thought she was just another struggling customer, they were now on edge. They didn't know who they were dealing with. I've been speaking with my husband, Jasmine finally said, after a brief conversation. He's the one who owns this bank, and I'll be making a few changes here today. The faces around her froze. The manager, who had been so confident just minutes ago, now stood in stunned silence. The receptionist, who had brushed her off earlier, was now pale with disbelief. They didn't know how to react. This was not the woman they had assumed she was. The security guard, who had laughed earlier, no longer dared to make a sound. Jasmine's calm, controlled demeanor now radiated a quiet power, one that couldn't be ignored. Jasmine looked at the manager, her voice unwavering. You'll be hearing from my husband's legal team soon. This bank will be operating differently from now on. In that moment, the balance of power had completely shifted. Jasmine was no longer the woman who was mocked and belittled. She was the woman in control, the one who commanded respect. She wasn't just a customer asking for help. She was the owner of the very space they had tried to ignore her in. And as the manager and staff processed the truth, Jasmine knew one thing for sure. They would never underestimate her again. The room was still, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of Jasmine's revelation. The manager was the first to break the silence, his voice faltering. I didn't know, he stammered, his face turning a deep shade of red. The receptionist, once dismissive and aloof, was now nervously fidgeting with the corner of her desk, unwilling to meet Jasmine's eyes. The security guard stood motionless, his previous bravado now replaced by uncertainty. Jasmine could see the panic building among them, the dawning realization that they had misjudged her, that they had belittled someone far more powerful than they could imagine. Their attempts to regain control were futile now. The power had shifted. They had no way to undo their earlier actions. You didn't know? Jasmine's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. Well, now you do. The manager's face flushed further as he rushed to apologize, his words stumbling over each other. I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Last Name. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. We'll have a private meeting right away to discuss. His voice trailed off as he realized that no matter what he said, it wouldn't change the fact that Jasmine had already won. Jasmine didn't respond right away. She let the silence hang between them, watching as they scrambled to find their footing. The smugness, the dismissiveness, everything that had made her feel small, worthless, was slipping away from them, and it felt good. Her gaze shifted slowly to the receptionist. It's funny how people change when they realize who they're dealing with, Jasmine said, her voice smooth but carrying an undeniable weight. The receptionist looked down, too embarrassed to speak. As the chaos of their reactions began to die down, Jasmine felt something inside her shift. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't even vindictive. She was at peace. The power she had claimed, not just in this moment, but in her life, wasn't about making others feel small. It wasn't about proving herself. It was about taking control of her life, of her choices, of her worth. For so long, she had allowed herself to be pushed around, to be dismissed, to be invisible. But now she understood something profound. True power comes from within. Her journey hadn't been just about money or status. It was about something far more important: self-respect. Jasmine had been afraid for so long of standing up for herself, of letting others see her as more than the image they had made of her. But now she was finally standing tall, not because of the wealth she now knew she had, but because of the strength she had always carried inside her. Jasmine turned to leave, feeling a calm sense of accomplishment. She didn't need to say anything more. The power dynamics had shifted. Justice had been served, not through some grand act of revenge, but through quiet, undeniable authority. She had proven something to herself and to the people around her. She was more than enough. As the door clicked shut behind her, Jasmine couldn't help but smile. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. As Jasmine stood at the top of the building, looking out over the sprawling city below, a sense of calm washed over her. The world felt different now, clearer, more open. She had climbed mountains, faced rejection, and been pushed to the edge of her limits, but now she stood tall, unshaken by the world that had once tried to crush her. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that bank, humiliated and invisible. She was stronger now. In every trial, every moment of doubt, Jasmine had found something deeper within herself. She realized that her worth was never tied to the opinions of others. It wasn't about the wealth, the status, or the titles. It was about how she saw herself. Jasmine thought back to those early days when she had doubted her place in the world. How many times had she felt small? How many times had she allowed others to define who she was? But now, none of that mattered. Her journey had taught her that true power wasn't about external validation. It was about embracing who she was, flaws and all, and owning it. As she looked out over the city, she felt a sense of pride in herself that she had never known. She had earned her place, not just in this city, but in her own life. While Jasmine had found strength in herself, the people around her had also changed. Her husband, the man who had quietly supported her from the shadows, was no longer just her partner. He was her equal. He had stood by her during her darkest moments, never once doubting her potential, but now they were building something together. They weren't just husband and wife. They were two forces united, each one bringing their own power and vision to the table. Jasmine remembered their first conversation about the bank, the uncertainty in her voice as she questioned if she could really do it. Her husband had smiled, his eyes filled with quiet confidence, and told her, "You already have everything you need. Just believe in yourself." That was all it had taken. His belief in her had sparked something inside her, a fire that could never be extinguished. Now, as they worked together to shape their future, Jasmine saw how their partnership had transformed her. They weren't just creating a legacy for themselves. They were building something for the people who had been overlooked, just like she once was. Her relationships with others had also deepened. The people she once saw as threats, as obstacles, had become her allies. She had built bridges with people who had once doubted her colleagues at the bank, the staff who had dismissed her, and even the people in her personal life who had questioned her potential. But most importantly, Jasmine had learned to believe in herself. She wasn't seeking approval from others anymore. She was creating her own path. The world may have tried to box her in, but Jasmine had proven that she couldn't be confined by anyone's narrow view of her. She was limitless. As the sun set over the skyline, Jasmine took a deep breath. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The future was wide open, and she was ready to walk into it, head held high. Just when Jasmine thought she had reached the peak of her journey, a shadow loomed over her once again. It came from someone she never expected, the same bank executives who had once underestimated her. They had watched her rise, and now, desperate to regain some shred of control, they made one last attempt to tear her down. A series of legal documents were served to her, an injunction accusing her of fraud and claiming that her purchase of the bank was illegal. The accusations were ludicrous, but the timing wasn't accidental. Jasmine had become a target. The powerful people who had tried to silence her before now saw her as a threat, and they thought they could use the law to bring her down. For a brief moment, Jasmine's heart sank. The weight of the accusation pressed on her chest, and she felt a familiar wave of doubt begin to rise. Would this be the thing that broke her? Would they finally succeed? But then, as quickly as the doubt crept in, Jasmine pushed it aside. She had fought too hard, too long to let something like this stop her now. The truth was clear in her mind. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that bank months ago. Jasmine didn't panic. Instead, she went to work, gathering her legal team, leveraging her resources, and preparing for battle. What the executives didn't realize was that Jasmine had outsmarted them long ago. While they had focused on tearing her down, she had been building her defense with the same precision and strategy that had taken her to the top. As the day of the court hearing arrived, Jasmine walked into the courtroom with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The executives were sitting on the other side, their faces twisted in disbelief that they were being challenged by someone they had once considered less than. When the case was presented, it didn't take long for the judge to see the truth. Jasmine's team had laid out the facts with precision, proving that the accusations against her were baseless and filled with nothing but petty retaliation. The final twist came when Jasmine stood up to make her statement. She wasn't rattled, she wasn't defensive, she was powerful. "You underestimated me," she said, her voice steady and strong, "but I'm not the woman you thought I was. I'm not here to be pushed aside anymore. I'm here because I earned my place, just like everyone else in this room." The judge ruled in her favor. The case was dismissed, and the executives who had tried to ruin her were left scrambling for answers. It was clear. Jasmine had won. And this time, it wasn't just the bank she had taken control of. It was her life, her choices, and her future. As she walked out of the courtroom, Jasmine could feel the weight lift off her shoulders. She had faced down the final obstacle, and she had come out victorious. But more than that, she had faced herself. She had conquered the fears, the insecurities, and the doubts that had once held her back. She was no longer the woman who needed to prove herself. She was the woman who had already won. As Jasmine stood at the edge of the balcony, overlooking the city that had once seemed so indifferent to her, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. It hadn't been easy. She had faced rejection, mockery, and an endless barrage of obstacles. But through it all, one truth had become clear. Her worth was never tied to what others thought of her. The people who had tried to bring her down had underestimated her. They had seen her as just another person they could ignore, dismiss, or control. But Jasmine had learned that true power doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from within. It comes from believing in yourself when no one else does, from pushing forward even when the world tells you to stay down. Her journey wasn't about getting back at those who had wronged her. It was about something far deeper, learning to stand tall in her own skin. Jasmine had realized that no matter where she came from or how the world tried to define her, she was enough, and that was something no one could take away from her. The most important lesson of all was that your strength is not determined by others. It doesn't matter how many times you've been knocked down, how many people try to make you feel less than. What matters is how you get up, how you choose to define yourself in the face of adversity. The moment you stop waiting for permission from others to be who you are, that's when you truly begin to live. If you've ever faced an overwhelming force in your life, something that made you question your worth, share your story in the comments below. Let others know how you fought back and found your strength. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, hitting that like button helps keep this message alive. Remember, you are not defined by what others think of you. Your worth is yours to own.